Hey everyone, welcome to Thinking Christian, and in this video what I'm going to do is give a review of Myron Penner's book, The End of Apologetics, Christian Witness in a Postmodern Context. So I've already done a summary of this book in another video, and I'll have a link in the description, so watch that first if you want to know what this book is about. Though I guess if you've read it and you want to hear my thoughts on it, you don't have to watch it. But really, I think this is a groundbreaking and important book, but there are a few issues I have with the book, or a few things, small things that I wanted to talk about. But I do recommend it. I do think it's worth reading. And one of the problems here is I'm probably going to be talking more about stuff in this book that I disagree with, just because I think the book makes so many other good points that I feel like, I don't really need to reiterate this. So I don't want me talking about things that I may question or may challenge to make it seem like I disagree with this book or don't recommend it. I think this is really worth a read, brings up a lot of really interesting points. So yeah, just read the book if you're interested in this topic. So I'll give my overview, just overall pros and cons. The first thing, I think it raises some really interesting key issues in the modern apologetics debate, which is why I think this book is so useful and interesting. It's well written. I mean, it's a little dense, but you're dealing with some very difficult subject matter, and it's about as good as it could be communicating these concepts. And it cites many good sources, serious philosophical thinkers in the past. This isn't just a surface level treatment of these issues. I mean, Penner has really done a lot of research and work and put a lot of thought into this. The main cons I would say about this book is, first of all, I think it is a little uncharitable to Craig's view, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I do find this to be a little bit problematic. Number two is I think it maybe goes too far in rejecting the use of reason and the role of arguments. We'll talk more about this too, because it can be a little bit more nuanced. And then finally, just a final nitpick, I think he should have brought in Heidegger a little bit. Heidegger's idea of being, when talking about being in the world, and Heidegger's subjective-objective distinction, kind of a rejection of Cartesian, of René Descartes' ideas of the subject-object distinction. These are all Heidegger's ideas, and I think it would have just been fine to just cite Heidegger or say, Heidegger talked about this too. I'm curious why Penner didn't do that, because I'm sure he's familiar with Heidegger. So interesting thing. So first thing to talk about is modernism versus postmodernism. So he once again talks about philosophical modernism in the Enlightenment is marked by an attempt to free human thought from its dependence on external sources, such as traditions, assumptions, or other authorities for the grounds of belief. And he talks about basically the ethos of modernity is defined by secularity. And I think this is a fair point, and I think we should really challenge this. But I would also say is that modern and sort of Western philosophy is a very Christian endeavor and is likely separable from it, right? So the people who were doing Western philosophy for the longest time was the Christian church, or was the Catholic Church, at the time. So the idea that once again, modernity or reason being hostile to Christianity, I think is difficult. But I do see Penner's point, because I think Penner's point is this idea that everything needs to be kind of like scientifically reasoned, like objectively reasoned in terms of principles that are independent of people's personal experience. That in and of itself may be if that's itself a product of modernity, then that statement itself may be subjective. And I would say too, not all or even most of the modernists or Enlightenment thinkers think this way about God. I see Penner's point, but there are a lot of, really good philosophers and scientists and other people in the Enlightenment, in modernity, who do see this as supporting belief in God. So while I do see Penner's point, I don't necessarily think that modernity and Christianity are as much at odds as Penner originally suggests. Although I do see the point that he's talking about, this sort of secularity, this sort of inclination to atheistic tendencies, or perhaps I would argue agnostic tendencies, is definitely a different thing. But I think his contribution to postmodernism is really this subjective objective distinction. I had always been told that postmodernism was skeptical of claims to objective truth. This is not true. I think postmodernism is skeptical of epistemic claims to objective truth, not the existence, not the ontological status of objective truth. And as a result, I think before I read this book, I didn't realize that I was actually more postmodernist. I was actually critical of postmodernism because I had a wrong idea of what postmodernism actually was. And it turns out there are actually some lines of postmodernism that I really do agree with. I wouldn't consider myself a radical postmodernist, but there are many ways in which I do kind of embrace a postmodern line of thought. And I would argue that there are many philosophers, many serious analytic philosophers who are postmodernists. I think Alvin Plantinga is actually in some ways a postmodernist thinker, even though he very much comes from this analytic tradition. And in this way, Charles Taylor, also a postmodernist thinker, even though he is once again using reason and modern philosophy to do, to make his arguments and these sorts of things. So once again, this crucial distinction was something I'd never really thought before, and this is why this book was very useful to me. I don't think apologetics should be hostile to postmodernism as a result of all this. I understand the hesitancy because postmodernism tends to be skeptical of the sort of narratives, meta-narratives like Christianity as a whole, but that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't true, and perhaps postmodernism and Christianity should listen to each other a little bit more than sometimes they do. He says, Penner says that basically modern apologetics imagines itself in modern terms to be engaged in an objective, rational discourse outside of political power and other biases, so it may present the untarnished and objective truth about things. Basically, Penner's criticism of apologetics is that it acts like it isn't based on other subjective things. But in this way, you could argue that it's a reaction to other modernists who argue that their freedom from God is objective and rational. And this is where I think Penner's critique moves into this sort of, they're both trying to act like their statements are objective and untarnished to make influences and not being forthcoming or authentic, or I guess they're not being authentic about what they're actually saying. They're not being forthcoming about it. But the other thing I would say is I don't think knowledge is ever necessarily separable from power. I mean, Bacon didn't think so. Like knowing things will always give you some ability to influence your environment. I mean, if it's true knowledge, like knowing facts versus knowing falsehoods is going to be helpful. So I think there's certainly some nuance here. It's not that all knowledge is necessarily free from any sort of political influence, but perhaps I think Penner's criticism, and I would agree with him on, is, and maybe he could have made this point a little bit clearer, is that it's the idea of presenting truths that are maybe in some ways more subjective than we like to think. We feel the need to overestimate the objectivity of these truths to give them a fair hearing, and that's just the way that the discourse is designed. So now we're going to talk about the use of reason. Now, Penner's point, and I think this is a very interesting point, is that the problem with modern apologetics is that Christian thought has already given up far too much by merely acknowledging and responding to the modern challenges to Christian belief, as if these objections had the sort of claim on the legitimacy of faith. So this would be like modern historical biblical criticism, this sort of thing, HBC, and requiring, belief in God to be rationally warranted, these other sorts of things. I think it paints a picture of a much smaller God than we would actually believe. And I think this is a fair point, right? If we actually think or believe the truth of Christianity does not need rational belief, then these attacks don't really do much to threaten our belief. And this is where you could cite somebody like Alvin Plantinga. I don't really want to call him a postmodernist, but his views are sort of postmodern in a certain way. But the funny thing is he's following the analytic Enlightenment philosophical tradition to make this case. At the same time, though, if it can be supported by reason, if Christian truth can be supported by reason to demonstrate its coherence, why wouldn't we also try to bring in some reasons as well? Rather than necessarily responding to these sorts of things, why not just simply say, hey, look, like Christianity is a reasonable thing to have even under the conditions of modernity. Like you don't have to choose. And I'll talk about this more when I talk about Penner and Craig and where they're sort of clashing. But I think one of the points that I want to say is it is postmodern, which is Enlightenment and modernity focused rationalism, that leads people to reject modernity in the first place. So it's kind of difficult. It's difficult to separate knowledge from this historical context. But I agree with Penner on the point that sometimes focusing on a more personal level is often more productive and more useful. However, I think the problem is what about people who are still stuck in this modern impulse? How does Penner think we should change their mind? I think this is something that's very difficult, right? If Penner obviously thinks people that are trying to focus on producing objective and rationally warranted truths are misguided in a certain way. But how does Penner expect people to find this out if they aren't at least called out on this or challenged this? This would be something I'm not 100% sure what Penner thinks about this. And this is where we get to the point where Craig and Penner are really, I think, talking past each other. So Penner is very critical of Craig, but I think Craig does follow Plantinga, who is postmodern. And I think as the time that Penner spends criticizing Craig, it doesn't make him always the most charitable to Craig. Penner's point is that reason's function then is not to ground our truths, but to explain them. and reason depends on a logically prior truth, capital T, to situate it. And here's Craig, what Craig says in his book, Reasonable Faith. I've argued that we can know that Christianity is true because of the self-authenticating witness of God's Holy Spirit, and that we can show it to be true by means of rational argumentation and evidence. So notice here how Craig is not using reason to ground truths, rather using it to explain them. So really, Craig and Penner actually agree quite a bit on this. I think Penner thinks that Craig is basically engaging in these sorts of debates to try to prove that Christianity is rationally warranted, and perhaps that's part of what he's doing, but I don't think Craig has necessarily ever said that Christianity needs to be rationally warranted for it to be accepted. I think as a result, they're kind of talking past each other. Penner is saying, look, Christianity doesn't need any of these rational argumentation. Maybe it's not worth us even trying to respond to these. And I think what Craig is saying is maybe in a more local level, well, wait a minute, there are rational reasons one can use to be a Christian. So when somebody says there aren't any rational reasons and tries to present this as objective, we should push back on this. So I kind of agree with both of them on this. I just don't think that Penner, I don't know. I just feel that Penner isn't necessarily understanding what Craig's position is on this. Penner also criticizes what he calls the apologetics industry or the apologetics industrial complex. This is funny. I did spend more on Penner's book than most, if not all, books on apologetics. So once again, I don't know if this is the most charitable point, but I see Penner's point. I mean, how many people, how many YouTube channels function based on trying to generate new arguments, trying to respond to these challenges in a way where basically it's like fighting a war. It's like a culture war, but here's an argument, here's somebody's response, and then, oh no, we need to come up with a response. And it can be distracting from what our true goal is. And as a result, another thing I'll say, yeah, there are a lot of free courses and resources. It's difficult for me to see exactly who Penner is criticizing, especially because I think Penner's criticism is that it creates this, but I would appreciate if he acknowledged that I really think the people who are creating these books and stuff really think they're doing the right thing. So I think, I would appreciate if Penner acknowledged that, just saying like, hey, look, these people surely really do think that they're providing a rational basis, that they're helping people, they're helping believers. And there have been a lot of people that claim they've been helped by this, but he has to make the argument that despite all of this, it's difficult. But I think the point that he's getting at that's worth talking about is that this apologetics industry does create an industry built on showing other people are wrong rather than searching for truth, right? If you're so focused on debunking someone else or giving a rebuttal to an argument, you're kind of talking past each other. You're not putting yourself in a good place to evaluate an argument's merit. And I do agree with Penner on this. What I've seen recently is that a lot more discussions rather than debates. So I think basically, Penner's point makes sense in 2013, right off the heels of New Atheism, a lot of these sort of God debates, people like, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and then people like William Lane Craig, Frank Turek, these guys arguing over these sorts of things. What we've seen now in the last decade, since this book was published, is much more people sitting down and actually having a conversation. I think it's still polemic, and there's still definitely people who like debunking or calling other people out, but I don't know. Maybe Penner would think things have improved. Who knows? Maybe his book had an influence in this. And yeah, consider debates. I think this is a good point that Penner makes, and I want to acknowledge this, right? But why do we watch debates instead of conversations? Is it because we want our side to win? Like, why are debates so much more well-watched and attended than a conversation between two people who disagree, who are able to ask each other questions? I don't think these debates do much to cause people to walk away changing their mind. I don't think the goal is to change people's mind. I think people watch the debates because they want to see their side win. It's like a sport. It's not about finding truth. It's about maybe entertainment. It's about really watching someone get clobbered in some cases, which is a little interesting. So yeah, why are these things so polemic? Wouldn't it be better, if we're really looking for truth, if we could sit down and make sure we understand what our basically debate partner is saying, as opposed to, trying to show that they're wrong at all costs? It's a fair point. Now I want to talk about edification and apologetic violence. Maybe my biggest criticism of this book. So Penner's issue with arguments is that basically arguments and evidence take away from me being authentic, and they shield me from actually potentially admitting that I'm wrong or other sorts of things that I'm, subjective in this particular thing. I present what I believe, what I personally believe on, based on my own experience as objective, because that's the only way other people are going to think it's legitimate. And that's a fair concern. And you basically remove any threat to your beliefs or self-perception by basically saying, okay, if you agree with me on this, I don't have to evaluate my own beliefs because then it means that I'm right. Fair enough. Now, when Penner says the primary apologetic and evangelistic goal here is to change the unbeliever's mind rather than edify the person, what I would say is why not both? Why can't apologetics or evangelism do both? Consider this, right? We go to university to basically learn to become independent thinkers, but we also sometimes need to learn stuff, and sometimes we have views about the world that are incorrect. Maybe I went to college thinking that Newtonian mechanics is true. And what I come to learn in college is not only to learn to think about these things independently, but also realize, hey, wait a minute, there were some things that I had thought before that were wrong or were only approximately true, or these other sorts of things. So I think this is the point. I think this is a false dichotomy to say that changing somebody's mind and edifying the person would need to be at odds. Think of also therapy. Sometimes people have thoughts or thought patterns that are destructive to them. And as a result, you could say the goal of therapy is to help the person become a happy, healthy, well-functioning person in society. And sometimes that will involve changing their mind about certain destructive patterns or habits or thought processes they have. So that's where I would say maybe it's kind of both, but maybe Penner's point, that's a good point, is perhaps our goal should always be edification over changing minds, and we should focus only on changing minds when that gets in the way of edification. He says, will someone who believes that they've heard God speak bother to make clever arguments, brilliantly piecing together the evidence so that the rational inescapability of the message is shown to be universally, objectively, and neutrally justified? I see where Penner's going, but remember, Paul did this. He reasoned with the Jews. This is Acts 17:17. I think if you do feel like you've heard God speak, you're going to want to engage with other people and share this with other people. And one of the ways in which you could do this is by appealing to things that they know by their own experience. The main word here is dialectico or dialectic. This is literally like the word like reasoned or kind of argued, not in like in a polemic way. We think of argue like an argument, but no, like he's actually doing this sort of dialectic. So once again, I think, we need to be careful. And I agree with Penner's point that we need to be careful, but I don't want this to go so far and say, oh, well, we should just share how God impacted our lives, and that's all we need to do. For some people, that may work. They may respond to these sort of personal narratives. But for other people, they may not. And then at that point, what I would ask Penner is, well, is that point to show that their epistemology is wrong because they're not considering personal truth? Is it to show them, as Penner thinks he's showing other Christians, that it's the overall approach to finding truth that's wrong? I'm not sure. Now Penner argues a crucial plank in my description of truth is the conviction that, in the sense most important to the Christian gospel, truth can only edify. It cannot tear down. And this is where I do disagree with Penner. I think it can tear down. Truth can sometimes tear down edifices we build up of false belief, edifices of ourselves. It can, I would argue that Christianity does tear down boundaries about hate, deception. So if we're attached to our idea, if we're attached to, for instance, needing to feel superior to other people, Christianity is going to take this idea and tear it down. So it doesn't tear down the person, but it may tear down aspects of our belief that are unhealthy. So once again, I think, it would only tear us down if we're really holding on super tightly to these beliefs that are wrong. Where I say, people are really too attached to these ideas of hate or other things. These things will go down with the ship. So my point here is that Christian truth is edifying, but it's also challenging, and it does more than just make us feel good about ourselves. There are times we do get challenged. There are times we need to expand our mind. There are times we admit that we've been wrong about things. That's not always a comfortable process, but it's an important process if we're going to come to truth. So sometimes in the process of building up or edification will involve tearing down what doesn't work as what is untrue. Sometimes to build a new building or to do a remodel, you need to tear down the old building that was there, that wasn't working, that was flawed in some way. In this context, Penner says, look, the Christian apostle is one who has been edified by the truth and has also been dislodged by it or going through the violent process of being remade by something that is beyond the self. Notice how this violent process, the key here, once again, this seems to contradict the idea that truth can only edify and that it cannot tear down. I think Penner is right that sometimes being remade is a violent process. It's sometimes an uncomfortable process, but it's an important one. Now, whether Penner thinks that this is edification, maybe it's long-term edification, that's fair. I think that's a fair fair question if that's what he's saying. But once again, notice here this distinction. Yeah, it may not always feel edifying to be shown that we're wrong about things, but in the long run, we come to appreciate it because we come to truth. So yeah, while I agree with Penner and really do agree that this needs to be done with gentleness and respect, I don't think it follows that it shouldn't be done at all. I don't think the fact that if we do think we're right, we should at least be humble. We should engage humbly, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't at least be honest with the fact that we think somebody else is wrong. And this can be a very loving thing to do. Say, hey, you know what? I think you're wrong about this, and here's why. But I'm open that I'm wrong too. It's kind of a two-way street. So really the point here I'm trying to make is I don't think Penner is arguing there's no use for reason or arguments or anything like this. My concern is I think he just may be encouraging abandoning it a little bit too far. Which I'll say, yeah, why not? Why not both? Why not change the unbeliever's mind and edify the person? Or edify the person by changing their mind? Interesting sort of question. So basically overall, I really think, so Penner's criticism of apologetics is to say that in stark contrast to the church's earliest apologetics, kind of apologetic positivism emerges in modern Christian thought, according to which Christian beliefs must be demonstrably rational to be accepted. And his view of Christianity then is much more a way or an invitation to live, walk, or grow in the truth than it is a doctrine or set of beliefs whose truth we can grasp and cognitively master. And here's my middle path, right? Christianity is a way to live your life, but it also involves propositions about the world, and to the extent that we can harmonize Christian belief with reason, those who are interested, which are primarily philosophers, should try to do so while acknowledging that this is not strictly necessary to becoming a Christian. I love talking about arguments for God, but at the same time, I think I understand Penner's point that talking about this too much may make it seem like the only reasons I have to be a Christian are arguments. I talk about arguments and arguments for God because I enjoy it, not because I think my Christian belief is necessarily supported by this alone. I think it is supported by these arguments. I think if all of these arguments failed, I would probably be a little bit weaker or shakier in my belief. But still, I talk about these arguments not because I'm trying to change someone's mind per se, but because I think they're fun, interesting, and they help us learn and talk about things more closely. So anyway, thanks for watching. If you've read the book, let me know. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my criticisms, or if you think I'm misrepresenting Penner in any way. I'd like to know. But once again, great book. Would recommend reading it. And thanks for watching.